I really love that sound. It's like almost like meditational sound to me. Here's Neil. Yeah, the sound of woodpeckers in the forest. It just gives me a feeling of being, very deep in nature, with absolutely nobody around, peace, fresh air. Yeah, I mean, that's just two of the many reasons why I love the forest so much. I also grew up with forests. I was in the forest a lot. But of course, forests, I mean, we rely on forests not just as a haven for biodiversity and carbon capture and oxygen production, but also for a huge range of products that we use on a daily basis and products that we take for granted, just like our forests. But we've really got to be very careful here because forests in Germany and beyond, they are in bad shape. Forest dieback is reaching alarming levels, and around 80% of the trees here in Germany are considered unhealthy. So what do climate change and our activities mean for the forests, and how can we soften the blow? That's what I'll be looking at in this new On the Green Fence series on forests. But first of all, we need to get a better understanding of trees as a species. And so I'll be starting the series with something that I personally hadn't even heard of until recently. That is the communication of trees, or the so-called wood wide web, a vast underground microbial network that allows trees to communicate and even help each other.
I'm Thomas Crowther. I'm an ecologist at ETH Zurich, where we founded the Crowther Lab and Restore.
Thomas was among a group of scientists who completed the first ever map of the so-called Wood Wide Web, in which they drew on a database of more than 1.1 million forest inventory plots and more than 28,000 species of trees in over 70 countries. And their findings were instrumental to improving our understanding of trees and indeed how they communicate with one another. But before we take a closer look at the Wood Wide Web and why it's so important, also when it comes to climate change, I wanted to hear from Thomas why he is so fascinated by trees.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think about it a lot. And essentially my answer has to be that I just had no other option. When I was a kid, from before I can remember, I was obsessed with things like snakes and lizards. I remember, my family used to go on holiday with a French family in Angers, and all the other kids would be playing around in the pool, and I would just spend 24/7 just sitting, looking at the wall, obsessed with the lizards that are running around there. And I remember, the grandparents of the family we were visiting, I remember them saying, "What's wrong with him? Do you think there's something wrong with him?" And my dad, it was the first time I heard my dad be like, "No, what's wrong with the rest of us? He's obsessed with nature, and that's great." And I was always going to be working with nature, but I think the time it switched towards trees was when I applied to work on my PhD with a professor in Cardiff University. And I said, I want to work on snakes. And he said, you might not want to work on the thing that you love, because you'll have to take a lot of DNA, take a lot of skin samples, squeeze a lot of poo out of them, and do a lot of, hands-on hardcore stuff. Yeah. But what you might want to think about is working on the ecosystems that allow those snakes to survive. And so I was quickly transformed into the world of fungi and trees.
Thomas, what was your first reaction? Because, this term, the Wood Wide Web, I understand it was coined in the 90s. So it has been around for a while, but I must admit it wasn't really very present. I don't think I'd ever really heard of it consciously until recently. What was your first reaction when you heard of the Wood Wide Web?
Yeah, I think the first time I heard about it was from the work of Susan Simard and people like that. And, as a scientist, we know about the intimate connectivity between organisms in an ecosystem. And so it doesn't come as a huge surprise. I'd been studying fungi for a very long time. We know they translocate nutrients between host trees and within and throughout their ecosystems. But I think what was exciting is to see how it just captured people's imagination. This idea of this below ground, sort of like the brain of the forest, the neural network of the forest, keeping everything healthy and keeping things sustainable. It just captured the imagination. And obviously there's a lot of scientists who will say things like, myself included, at the time you think, look, the fungus isn't really trying to be friends with all the trees. That's almost like saying the ball boy is trying to be friends between the two tennis players on the other side of the court. The tennis players aren't helping each other. The ball boy is facilitating an interaction, but it's really just trying to optimize its own strategy. It's relocating nutrients where it needs. It's focusing on areas that are being damaged more than areas that are being that have a lot of nutrients. And it's just this natural redistribution of nutrients throughout the system that keeps it all functioning in a sustainable way.
I mean, when I first heard it, it sounded like a really clever pun to me. And it, as you said, it did capture my imagination. And immediately, of course, you make the connection to the internet, and you suddenly have this image of a huge global network. I mean, for somebody who has no connection to this particular topic, I mean, can you please describe how it was, in fact, proven that it exists? Because it could also sound a bit like hocus pocus to some people,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a few different approaches for doing it, but generally the crux of things are we can use stable isotopes. There's, the carbon and nitrogen in our planet is distributed through various different stable states, and you can introduce those stable isotopes into an individual tree, and you can see if those nutrients and the carbon and nitrogen can move to other trees when they are connected or disconnected through the microbial web, through the fungal network. And we find that when that fungal network is intact, the nutrients and the carbon from the first tree will enter the second tree and the other trees around it via this below ground invisible microbial network.
Thomas, you were also part of the team. It was a Swiss-American team, right? That created this. It was the first ever world map, wasn't it, of the Wood Wide Web in 2019, I believe. Could you perhaps explain, how did you go about putting that together? And also how complete is this map? Are you adding to it, or is it done and dusted?
That's a great question. Yes, I was. We sort of was one of the leading groups in that team, bringing together massive amounts of data from experts all across the globe who'd studied their trees and their associations to the fungi below. And when we had all of that data together, we can use machine learning and statistical approaches to explore how connected those forests are across the globe, and we can see which types of mycorrhizal fungus dominate in which regions. But your final question is the key to it all. This is not finished, and it will never be finished. We are now, this gave us a new perspective on the scale and the interconnectedness of this system. But there is so much more left to explore about this immensely complicated, we call it the brain of the global forest system.
I mean, as I understand from the synopsis here, it says that it was drawn from a database of more than 1.1 million forest inventory plots and featuring some 28,000 species of tree. I mean, it just sounds vast. I mean, you really had your work cut out for you, right?
Well, yeah, this below ground world has been the final frontier of our understanding of these ecosystems. We know that they're immensely important, but we haven't been able to tap into this complexity before. But it is true, we live in a world of big data analytics, and we have vast networks of ecologists around the world. And by compiling that data and using these emerging analytical tools, we can get insights that we could never have dreamed of a few years ago. And so, yeah, it's only this big data revolution that's made this even begin to be possible.
Okay, Thomas, so I mean, in layman's terms, why is this network so important for trees and also, for our ecosystems at large? I mean, what happens, for instance, if this connectivity, I mean, I think we can all relate to it, right? If you have a bad internet connection, it's just really annoying. I mean, what happens if the trees have weak or no Wi-Fi signal? How bad is it for them?
Yeah, I'd say in this case, it's way more than just annoying. Those mycorrhizal fungi are absolutely essential to the functioning of about 90% of the world's trees, because the trees are fantastic at capturing carbon from the atmosphere, and their roots do an okay job of capturing nutrients from the soil, but they need those fungi to access the real extent of the nitrogen and phosphorus and other micronutrients that are essential for the tree to survive. So it's really this symbiosis between the tree or the plant and the fungus that allows them both to coexist. The tree gives carbon to the fungus gives nutrients back to the tree. And in doing so, they have this symbiosis that means one couldn't really exist without the other. It means that managing an ecosystem above ground can't really work unless we're understanding how to manage it below ground too.
So deforestation then also kills the fungi below ground?
Unfortunately, yeah. In most systems, we do see that, depleting the forests means that we get a massive loss of the mycorrhizal fungi. There will be other fungi there, and there can often be spores that last a little while so that ecosystems can regenerate. But yes, when we destroy trees, we also destroy their symbionts.
So, I mean, the Wood Wide Web, it also suggests communication, a lot of communication, right? I mean, is it true that trees even talk and support each other, through this network?
I mean, there's certainly a network that connects the individual trees within this forest, and those trees' behavior, their growth and their adaptations to stress and to damage will be influenced by the signals they're getting from other trees in the ecosystem. So it's this connection that makes the ecosystem sustainable. We really see trees that are struggling for nutrients will often be enhanced by the network, because the fungi will redistribute nutrients towards those struggling trees. Or areas where there's been a lot of insect damage, we often see those trees starting to the trees nearby will put up defenses so that they can be ready for an insect infestation. Now, we can never say the exact that is only mediated by the fungal network. It's certainly one of the mechanisms through which these trees interact, along with some of the other things like the volatile compounds that they produce through their leaves. But this connectivity is what keeps the whole system going.
Okay. But I mean, that sounds like then also that trees, they can potentially warn each other of dangers or approaching dangers.
We don't know if they're intending to warn each other, but they certainly do get signals from one another. So if you're a tree next to me and you start freaking out because of some insects, I will react to that and I'll start putting up some protection.
Wow, that's impressive. I mean, Thomas, if we look at this, it's a very intricate web, and I mean, most of it is happening underground, right? That's where it's all going down. It's been around for 500 million years, I understand, which, I mean, that's longer than us, right?
Yeah.
How has it? How has it changed? Since humans came on the scene, what kind of impact are we having on it?
You're right. So the human impact on these ecosystems it's a very complicated thing to project and to predict, and it varies all across the globe. But obviously, mass agriculture and mass land clearing is the major impact that we've had. We've disrupted this network to a huge degree, to the extent that first the trees are no longer there, sucking carbon into the system, but whatever remains struggles to be sustained because they lack those essential microbial connections below that are necessary for keeping the ecosystem sustainable. So whenever we damage an ecosystem above ground, we damage it below ground. Now, that's, that direct human impact is certainly the biggest threat that we see at the moment. But there's also an underlying threat of climate change. If we look at this global system, we see that there's two major groups of mycorrhizal fungi. There's the ectomycorrhizal fungi, which dominate, I think it's around 60% of the stems on Earth, but that's only 2% of the species. And that's because they're all up in the temperate and the boreal forest. Down towards the tropics, all the other species are dominated by arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And now these two different types of fungi have different approaches for capturing carbon and nutrients. And ultimately, the ones in the tropics facilitate much faster carbon cycling. And as climate changes, there's concerns that we are going to warm all of these ecosystems and shift the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the second type, up north, so that those faster cycling systems are happening up north. And that will lead to increased losses of carbon from the soil back into the atmosphere. And so the gradual shifting of fungi from slow cycling to fast cycling is one that could potentially drive carbon losses into the atmosphere that could then drive a feedback to accentuate the rate of climate change.
That sounds like another tipping point in a certain respect. Then if heating reaches a certain stage, that, if I understand you correctly, just to summarize that, there are two types of fungi. One is better for storing carbon than the other, and climate change is promoting the one that isn't so good in storing carbon.
I mean, that's a good summary. Yeah, that's the concern from a carbon storage perspective. Obviously, these fungi form various different processes within their ecosystems. But yes, it does seem like we might be stepping towards a tipping point where we are, promoting the fungi that release more carbon into the atmosphere, which would drive additional warming.
Right. Well, I mean, okay, in that sense, of course, decarbonizing our societies is the key. We need to get to net zero, that's clear. But is there anything else, that we as humans can do to improve, the Wood Wide Web and, keep that communication with a very strong Wi-Fi signal?
Well, you're absolutely right. Decarbonizing the first and foremost. We've got to stop this process and also stop mass land clearing. The pledges at COP to stop deforestation and limit deforestation are more important than ever. This is not just essential for climate action, but also for all other global threats like food insecurity, water insecurity, pandemics. We need to protect the ecosystems that are fully interconnected. But the more we understand about this system, the more we're realizing the hotspots of microbial activity that are most essential to protect and restore, to protect in the long term. But we can also promote microbial diversity as a means of stepping towards a more sustainable future in agricultural systems and in managed ecosystems. A huge proportion of the land surface, that almost 75% of the vegetated land surface, is covered by agriculture and sustainable forestry. These are places where the introduction of a healthy, native, diverse microbiome can actually increase your yields, increase your productivity, at the same time as promoting diversity. So it's almost like the microbiome is not only something that we need to protect, it's also an avenue for positive change in the future. Because right now, the agricultural landscapes, mass agricultural landscapes, are a desert for biodiversity. They're a desert for microbial life. But if we can incorporate healthy, diverse microbial systems into those managed systems, they can become reservoirs for microbial activity that can then not only improve productivity in those systems, but also improve the biodiversity in the natural systems surrounding them.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the Wood Wide Web, if I understood you correctly, there are also monocultures. There's not a lot of communication going on. You need mixed, diverse forests, and then you've got communication underground.
We always see that when we have better diversity above ground, we've also got better diversity below ground. We need to promote the mixtures of species both within the soil to have a healthy system and above the soil so that that system can be maintained.
So, given that, we use timber and wood for so many products and as a commodity, and that the future also, we're looking against the backdrop of the threat of forest fires, soil erosion, etc. Mixed forests seem to be the answer, right? A lot of the monocultures here in Germany, for instance, they're completely unsustainable, and we're gonna lose them eventually. It's just a question of time, right? If this is also an economic factor, and we tend to use, monocultures when harvesting timber. You just said the communication. If you have diversity above ground, you also have diversity below ground. What happens to forests who lose this internet or this diversity? What does this mean for the trees? Are they, I don't know, if we were trying to sort of, personalize these trees, do they become solitary, isolated, or what happens to them?
In a way, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. The more disconnected any organism becomes from its ecosystem, the less able it is to survive. Since the dawn of life on this planet, the one thing that's happened is, we were living in a lifeless volcanic rock, and then life emerged. And a few million years later, this life started diversifying. And since then, the core principle of our existence on the planet is that every species depends on other species to survive. That is the simple essence of ecology, including humans. We simply couldn't survive without most of the species on our planet, not just the food we eat, everything that we need from medicines and clean air, clean water. We need an infinite array of species. And whenever you isolate a species or an individual, that individual is vastly less capable of surviving in the long term. So yes, the more you disconnect that microbial system below, the more isolated those trees become, and the less able they are to be responsive to things like bark beetles or climate change or human disturbance.
Right. Coming back to this global map, the trees are connected, but the internet we have, that's connecting the entire globe, right? Does this apply to the Wood Wide Web as well? Are trees in Europe connected to trees in South America?
That's where the analogy is kind of interesting. It's not every tree is connected to every other tree. The trees are connected to their neighbors, and in connected forests, all of the trees will be connected, but not directly. They are connected via the interactions from other trees. And through this massive network, most of the trees within the system do end up being part of that immense Wood Wide Web. Now, remember, you can get hundreds of meters of this fungal mycelium in 1 gram of soil. These are tiny microscopic filaments that pervade the entire soil. And so it's really connecting all the ecosystem, all the plants within that system. But obviously, every time we we deforest or we fragment a forest, the connectivity is lost between those other forests. And the key thing is to try and build up that connectivity so that the ecosystems as a whole can be more sustainable.
Maybe this is also, I mean, you've touched upon this now with some of your answers already, but I mean, Thomas, to what degree are we underestimating the power of natural forests?
For me, nature is, I get a lot of times people ask me, should you really be focusing on natural climate solutions when, cutting emissions is so essential? And we wouldn't want to distract from, other decarbonizing efforts. My first answer is obviously not. This is a piece of the puzzle in fighting climate change. It's a very real piece. Protecting forests can limit 10 to 30% of our emissions. Restoring forests and allowing them to recover to their natural state can capture 10 to 30% of our carbon drawdown. This is a massive contribution to climate change. But the weird thing for me is that nature isn't just one of the solutions that we need to address climate change. It's one of the reasons that we need to address climate change. We are fundamentally trying to address climate change because we like life on Earth. Nature is the essence of life on Earth. It's our life support system. We wouldn't be here without it. If we managed to stop climate change at the expense of all nature, it would be a less livable planet than it is the other way around. We fundamentally need nature to survive.
If we look at nature and evolution and how much it, can change, adapt, adjust. We just said it, the Wood Wide Web has been around for 500 million years. Do you see this maybe evolving into something more sophisticated in future? I mean, do you think it's possible that trees could develop into something more than they are now because they have to?
I would never say never. Evolution has been driving some of the most incredible diversifications and things where you could never dream of, things that are from a fairy tale book. And so definitely they are constantly evolving, constantly refining, and constantly adapting to the crazy environment that humans are building around them. So definitely there's going to be constant evolution. Now, it's not like the mycorrhizal system will become analogous to our internet system. It's not like every tree will be connected to every other tree. But certainly, I fundamentally believe that there is a collective consciousness within these ecosystems such that different interacting organisms sort of respond interconnectedly to one another, to changes in the system. And the sort of ecosystem almost works as a whole. Like you damage one part of it, the other parts of the ecosystem are damaged. And these connections between them mean that this growth is going to continually continue as long as we allow it to do so,
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm also asking this question is because I just have this sort of, I don't know, I just have this feeling, when I'm in the forest and trees, I have a connection to trees. And, I have this this route that I walk, and there's also a particular tree. And it might sound wacky now, but I do stop at this particular tree each time when I pass it, and I touch it, and I might say a few words. But I just don't know. It just feels like I have a connection with this tree. And I'm just wondering, whether in terms of what we can explore or still learn about trees, I mean, is it such that we know everything about them there is to know? Or is there still, a lot of terra incognita in terms of there's so much more that we can explore about trees?
I think we've only just begun to touch the surface on what we know about these trees and their relationship with the rest of the species on the planet. I love your analogy about, having this connection with a tree, because I actually spend a lot of time, probably 3 or 4 days a week. I finish my work day and I go up into a nearby forest in Zurich, and I've got 2 specific trees that I string up a hammock between, and I spend about a couple of hours there most of these evenings, and I'm just staring at exactly the same trees. And every time it's not one individual tree. I like to sort of like let my focus go blurry and just see all of the infinite leaves and movements and twists and turns within the ecosystem that's surrounding it. And there's a collective essence of these systems that is way beyond what we can characterize in numbers in science right now. Maybe in the future we'll be able to even touch the surface of grasping the magic of these systems. But in a way, I'm quite happy that science will never be able to really capture that extent of the magic. We do our best to define things, but I love that it will be infinitely indefinable in its beauty.
Final question, Thomas, and it's not very scientific, I'm afraid. But, when you're lying in that hammock, when I'm touching my tree, do you believe that they're aware of our presence?
Is it like something to be a tree? I literally have this conversation quite a lot with one of my friends. Like, if it's like something to be a tree, would it be nice? I personally do think it's like something to be a tree, but I think that the concept of time is fundamentally different. I think for them, a decade passes the way that a day passes for us, and in doing so, there's this sort of, again, through the infinite interactions with everything that's going on around them, there is certainly a growth and an evolution and an adaptation that's happening. And I don't know if we define it through our definition of consciousness, but I think there's something going on there.
Professor Thomas Crowther from ETH Zurich, thank you very much for your time and talking with me here On the Green Fence. I do appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It was really good to chat.
Okay, so time for my main takeaways from this episode. First off, there is way more to trees than we know, and most of the action is actually happening below ground. So trees can communicate and react when neighbouring trees are threatened by insects, for instance. Trees have a symbiotic relationship with fungi, and there are two types of underground fungi that are crucial to the so-called wood wide web and the redistribution of nutrients within forest systems. One of them is also important for capturing carbon, and unfortunately that one seems to be adversely impacted by global heating, so that sounds like a negative feedback loop right there, which could result in even more CO2 emissions in the long run. So again, another urgent call to reduce our own CO2 emissions wherever we can and as fast as we can. And finally, just once again, this episode, it brought home to me just how interconnected everything is, how complex this web is, and how this huge treasury of biodiversity that we see above ground is also underground. And all those things that are happening below ground are just as precious and crucial for our own survival. And it's really important that we don't lose this wood wide web. Well, that's my 2 cents for now. Please do let us know what you think about trees and the wood wide web, and maybe you can also send us a picture of yourself and your favourite tree to post on our social media channels. Don't be shy, just send us an email to onthegreenfence@dw.com. In the next episode of this series, I'll be looking at reforestation efforts and why simply planting more trees isn't always a good idea. That's it for now. Many thanks to my colleague and producer Natalie Muller and Tim Schauenberg, who helped put this series together. I'd also like to thank my sound engineer Gerd Georgi, and a big thank you to all of you out there for listening and rating On the Green Fence. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.
On the green fence.